Europe, 1914, the most powerful empires on earth stood armed, ambitious, and deeply suspicious of one another. Across the continent, massive armies prepared for a conflict nobody could fully stop anymore. Tension filled the air like a storm waiting to explode. Millions of young soldiers marched proudly toward war. Many believed the fighting would last only a few weeks. Politicians promised victory, crowds cheered in the streets. Nobody imagined how brutal the coming years would become. What followed was unlike anything humanity had ever seen before. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes transformed war into industrialized slaughter. Entire landscapes were destroyed, millions would die in mud, smoke, and fire. Before the war began, Europe was divided into powerful military alliances. Nations promised to defend one another if war erupted. On one side stood Germany and Austria-Hungary. On the other stood France, Russia, and Britain. The continent had become dangerously divided. Countries competed to build larger armies and more powerful weapons. Factories worked day and night producing rifles, artillery, battleships, and ammunition. Military power became a symbol of national pride. Europe was preparing for war long before the first shot was fired. Nationalism spread rapidly across Europe. Many people believed their nation was stronger, smarter, and more important than others. Patriotism became extreme. Rivalries between countries grew more aggressive every year. Peace across Europe was becoming increasingly fragile. The Balkans had become one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Different ethnic groups wanted independence. Powerful empires competed for influence and control. Tensions increased year after year. Europe was becoming more unstable, more aggressive, and more paranoid, and then the spark finally came. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in Sarajevo. Security was weak, yet nobody expected the visit to change world history forever. A Serbian nationalist group had prepared an assassination plan. Several conspirators waited silently along the streets. They carried bombs and pistols. Each one hoped to strike the Archduke before he escaped the city. Earlier attempts had failed. The Archduke survived. But later that day, fate intervened. His driver accidentally took a wrong turn into a nearby street. Suddenly, the royal car stopped directly beside one of the assassins. The assassin could hardly believe his luck, standing only a few meters away. He pulled out his pistol and fired 2 shots. Within minutes, Franz Ferdinand and his wife were dead. The streets erupted into panic and chaos. But nobody yet understood how catastrophic the consequences would become. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia immediately. Germany promised military support. Russia prepared to defend Serbia. France backed Russia. Britain watched nervously as Europe moved closer to war. One alliance after another activated like falling dominoes. The continent was marching toward disaster. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia immediately. Germany promised military support. Russia prepared to defend Serbia. France backed Russia. Britain watched nervously as Europe moved closer to war. One alliance after another activated like falling dominoes. The continent was marching toward disaster. Germany launched the Schlieffen Plan, hoping to defeat France rapidly before Russia could fully mobilize. To do this, German armies invaded neutral Belgium. The invasion shocked Europe. Britain immediately declared war on Germany. Suddenly, the conflict became far larger than anyone imagined. Across Europe, patriotic crowds celebrated in the streets. Flags waved everywhere. Bands played military songs. Young soldiers marched proudly through cheering cities. Many believed war would bring glory and honor. They had no idea what modern industrial warfare truly looked like. Machine guns could fire hundreds of bullets every minute. Artillery shells destroyed entire villages instantly. Soldiers charging across open fields were cut down in seconds. Modern technology transformed the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. By the end of 1914, thousands were dying every single day. Soon, both sides dug enormous trench systems stretching across Europe. The Western Front became a giant scar across the land. For years, soldiers would fight and die for only a few kilometers of territory. Life inside the trenches was miserable. Soldiers lived surrounded by mud, disease, rats, and corpses. Rain constantly flooded the trenches. Food was poor. Sleep was rare. Every day felt like a nightmare with no escape. Some soldiers developed trench foot after standing in cold water for days. Infection spread rapidly. Medical treatment was often limited. Many soldiers suffered physically and mentally long before they ever reached the battlefield. Day and night, artillery shells exploded overhead without warning. The sound was endless. Soldiers lived in constant fear that the next explosion could kill them instantly. Many experienced severe psychological trauma from the non-stop bombardment. Then came the order every soldier feared most, over the top. Thousands climbed out of the trenches and charged directly toward enemy machine guns. Bullets tore through entire waves of soldiers within seconds. The battlefield became absolute chaos. Entire units disappeared within minutes. Smoke covered the battlefield. The wounded cried for help between explosions. Many soldiers died without ever seeing the enemy face to face. Battles like Verdun and the Somme became symbols of unimaginable horror. The war also introduced terrifying new weapons. Poison gas drifted silently across trenches, burning lungs and blinding soldiers. Men desperately searched for gas masks while panic spread everywhere. Even surviving an attack often left permanent damage. Tanks appeared for the first time in history. Heavy armored machines slowly crossed the battlefield, crushing barbed wire and trenches. Although primitive, they represented the beginning of a new era of warfare. Airplanes also changed warfare forever. At first, they were used only for reconnaissance. But soon pilots fought deadly battles high above the trenches. The sky itself had become part of the war. Despite its name, the First World War was not fought only in Europe. Battles spread across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the oceans of the world. Entire colonies became involved in the conflict. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. Fighting erupted across deserts and mountains far from Europe's trenches. Soldiers faced brutal heat, disease, and exhausting conditions. Meanwhile, German submarines hunted enemy ships beneath the ocean. These underwater attacks terrified sailors and civilians alike. Global trade and transportation became extremely dangerous. German submarines sank civilian ships, including the Lusitania. The disaster shocked the world. Public anger in the United States increased rapidly as civilians continued to die at sea. Then Germany sent the Zimmermann telegram, proposing an alliance with Mexico against the United States. When the message became public, Americans were furious. Pressure for war grew stronger across the country. In 1917, the United States officially entered the war. Fresh American troops and supplies gave the Allies renewed strength. Germany, exhausted after years of fighting, slowly began to collapse. By 1918, millions were dead. Entire cities had been destroyed, soldiers were starving, exhausted, and traumatized. Germany's economy was collapsing, and morale continued to fall.
One by one, Germany's allies surrendered. Finally, on November 11th, 1918, the guns fell silent. After 4 years of destruction, the First World War was finally over.
The battlefield became strangely quiet. Smoke slowly faded above the ruined landscape. Millions had died, and millions more returned home permanently changed. But peace itself would soon create new problems. In 1919, world leaders gathered at Versailles to create peace. They hoped to prevent another global conflict from ever happening again. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war. The country lost territory, military power, and enormous amounts of money. Many Germans felt humiliated and betrayed by the treaty, although the treaty officially ended the war. It also created anger and instability across Europe. Deep resentment continued to grow in Germany. The seeds of another world war had already been planted. More than 16 million people died during the First World War. Empires collapsed, borders were redrawn. Technology advanced rapidly, but humanity paid a terrible price. It was called the war to end all wars. But only 20 years later, the world would burn again. And the next war would become even more devastating than the first.